Hello, beautiful humans. Thaís Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the Podcast. I'm your host, Thaís Sky. Thanks for being here. As I was thinking about this episode, I was reflecting on how I used to name my YouTube channel Thaís Talks. And I would say something like, welcome to Thaís Talks, where you become the most empowered person you know. Gosh, what a long time ago. Okay, welcome. I'm here in my living room. I'm wearing a cozy Taylor Swift sweatshirt, and I thought that I would come all cozy to you all to talk about grief. Because it's been very relevant in my life in the past few months. And I think grief is always a very relevant topic for most of us. And I haven't talked about it in a while. So I thought I would open up the conversation. I have some thoughts that I wrote down on all sorts of things that I want to talk about when it comes to grief. More specifically, I'm interested in exploring the complicated types of griefs, the griefs that feel like it really takes hold of our hearts. Because there's some grief that it's not that it's simple, like it's easy, but it's simple, like it's not complicated. It's a grief that we experience, a grief that we acknowledge, a grief that we move through, a grief that shapes and forms us, but it doesn't kind of stay. And then there's the types of grief that really stay with us and dampen us and pull us down and can feel unshakable and can feel life-altering and personality-altering. And those are the types of griefs that I've been thinking about and want to talk to you all today. But before I get into that, just want to let you know right now there's a few ways that we can work together, and I want to share what those ways are in case it is of interest to you. Number one, I do have some one-on-one spots open, one-on-one psychotherapy. You can learn more by going to thaissky.com/therapy. I also will link it in the show notes. If you are wanting to be supported and partnered as you make sense of your inner scaffolds, your inner landscape, and you want to kind of grapple with and work through some difficult entrenched patterns, relationship difficulties, if you struggle with trauma, with eating disorders, these are some of my specialties. I also, of course, work very intimately around this idea of self-worth, the worthiness wound, and how it can often paralyze us. And so you can, again, go learn more at thaissky.com/therapy. I have in-person availability in my office in Westwood, Los Angeles, and I do also have virtual spots for you wherever you are. Okay, number two, I do offer couples therapy. So if you and your partner, I work with all different types of couples. I also work with friends, I work with colleagues. If you and somebody else are in a relationship that feels really, really important and you're navigating some conflict, some ruptures, some things that feel irreversible and profoundly damaging, and you're really struggling and you want to make sense of all of it, couples therapy may be useful for you. You can go to thaissky.com/couples to learn more about how I work with couples and setting up our first appointment. And then the final way that I work with people right now is through my mentorship for depth coaches. I've been offering mentorship for depth coaches for 3-4 years now. And this mentorship is a mastermind. It's an incubator. So there's a max of 4 women. It's a very small space for those who are driven towards creating something really sustainable and ethical. They want to create a coaching practice that will allow them to live the life that they want while also doing really meaningful work. This is akin to supervision in clinical spaces like the mental health field. I deeply believe that the best ways that we can learn how to do the work of healing and facilitating and holding space for other humans is through something like a mentorship, a supervision space where we get to really reflect on the work. And I think too often in the coaching spaces, the emphasis lies on business building without thinking about the imperative nature of a strong foundation that comes through developing coaching capacity, coaching skill, coaching voice. So you can learn more by going to thaissky.com/mentorship. Okay. So those are the ways that you can work with me right now. And if you are interested in just learning more about me in general, you're welcome to go to my website, thaissky.com. You're welcome to join my newsletter list. I never send emails, but you can join that list in case you do want to be notified of anything that happens in my corner of the world. Okay, so let's talk about grief. It's important when we're thinking about grieving that we just kind of acknowledge that not all grief is the same. That some work through us and some don't. Some turn into something bittersweet where there's a sadness, but it feels like there's a sweetness to the sadness, like a way in which we're able to hold the loss with loving kind of embrace, right? And then there are some types of grief that stay tremendously bitter and continue to feel like a bitter pill to swallow. And in fact, it may often feel like we can't swallow it and digest it at all. And of course, when we're talking about grief, we're not just talking about, let's say, the loss of an individual, but of course, the loss of relationships, the loss of a job, a career, a loss of a dream, a fantasy of who we wanted to be. Oftentimes, when we're talking about grief, we think that it's only relevant to talk about grief when we're talking about the death of a person. And I think when we do that, we really narrow the conversation unnecessarily, because so much of life is actually about grief. And this is obviously not a concept that I've come up with. I mean, it's something that's in the cultural understanding of human psychology, that in many ways, if we are to live the big, delicious life that we want to live, right, if we want to live a full life, it is going to be mired in grief. And this can be really, really hard to navigate and to work through. And I support people in working through this. So many of us are so terrified of feeling disappointment, of feeling let down, of feeling abandoned, of feeling rejected. We're so terrified of relationships going sour. We're so terrified of conflict. We're so scared of what it means to actually be in relationship with people that we hope that if we're just not in any relationship at all, then we can avoid that work, or we can avoid those feelings. But we also hope, wildly enough, that we can be without relationships, that we can be without intimacy, that we can be without hooking ourselves in and still experience joy, love, intimacy, closeness. Like, this is the paradox, is that we actually don't want closeness, and we so desperately want closeness that we want to experience all the good things that life have to offer: love, joy, humor, spaciousness, but we're actually terrified of doing the things that are required in order to feel that way. Because if we are to feel happiness, for example, we also must allow ourselves to feel sadness. If we are to love, we also have to experience loss. And this can be really, really scary, really, really difficult. And yet it is our ability to bear this truth that allows us to find true joy in our lives. Because a life well lived, right? A full life, whatever that looks like for you. You each have different goals of what that means, but a full, well-lived life is also one that is filled with grief and heartbreak. We cannot love without loss. Because the relationship ends, because the person dies, because circumstances change, because that person grows in ways that we didn't anticipate. So much of long-term relationships is about grieving a version of the relationship that will be no more. If our significant other is grappling with a loss that's really significant, let's say a loss of a parent or a loss of a family member that was really close to them, you may now be experiencing kind of a secondary loss, so to speak, which isn't the technical word for it, but I don't actually know the technical word off the top of my head, but you'll also experience potentially the loss of the person who was before they lost that person. And so you may be now overwhelmed with a grief of the relationship, a grief of the person that you've lost, even though you may not have known that family member, because what you are losing is a version of this human that you have been in relationship with that is now going to be, he or she or they are going to be different because they're now grappling with a loss of their significant person, parent, relative, etc. We resist this, though. We resist this idea that a well-lived life is also a life filled with grief. We think sometimes that to grieve is that we're doing it wrong. We sometimes think that, like, if we had protected ourselves appropriately, we wouldn't experience grief. And we feel this way consciously, but also very deeply unconsciously. We think that if we are experiencing rejection, it's because it's a reflection of us. We did something wrong. If we experience abandonment, if someone abandoned us, it's because we did something, or because they are monstrous, they are bad, they are wrong. There is always, whenever we find this, either we're the bad ones or they're the bad ones, we're not really grappling with the reality, which often is much more nuanced and complicated. And we don't have to necessarily make the other person bad, but we do, because this is how we learn, right? This is what we say to ourselves. I don't want to ever experience risk or rejection. I don't want to risk rejection again. I don't want to get abandoned again. And so I'm going to make myself bad, or I'm going to make the other person bad. And therefore, I never actually work through it. And instead, I learn that I am not supposed to be in a relationship. We make kind of these massive conclusions about ourselves, and then we avoid relationships in the future. We see this all the time in movies and shows, people who try to harden themselves against relationships, and they end up living kind of a half-lived life, right? They're cutting themselves off of something really beautiful, which is what happens when we open ourselves up to the risk of rejection, which is intimacy. We really cannot have intimacy and closeness without there being the space for rejection, for abandonment, for conflict, because in order for us to be intimate, the person has to be an other. They have to be different than us. They have to be their full, autonomous, individuated self. As much as a person may be an extension of ourselves, we may be projecting onto them versions of ourselves. We're not actually relating to who that person is, hoping that if we can be very similar, if we can be the same, they won't leave us. But it doesn't actually work. And what it does actually do is actually prevent us from a closeness. But anyway, a well-lived life is a life of grief. So if grief is part of what it means to live a well-lived life, then we must become more intimate with, and get more familiar with, and get closer to grief. That makes sense, right? And so this is where I find us on this episode, in this conversation, is what are some ways in which we can think about grief so that it doesn't get stuck inside of us in a way that causes a type of like a depression or melancholia or kind of a deadness. And I say these words thinking very deeply about, and having read right before this podcast, a seminal paper written by Freud called Mourning and Melancholia. And he wrote this in 1917 as he was trying to really grapple with what is it that leads certain people to move through a grief in a state of mourning, where there's an acceptance on the other side. There's like... he didn't say acceptance like now everything's merry and dandy. He meant an acceptance more like we are able to continue to live a full life. Versus what happens, why do sometimes when we experience a loss, it turns into melancholia, or the modern equivalent of that is depression? Why is it that some forms of grief leads us into this really depressive state? Now, I think it's important that we be very gentle when we're talking about this, that I'm not saying that there is a timeline for grief. Everyone navigates grief differently. There's no right or wrong way to navigate grief, although there are consequences to how we navigate grief, and that can be really hard sometimes for us to bear, because we hope that we can be exempt from consequences when we're grappling with something so absolutely breathtakingly difficult. Something is being ripped apart from us. We are literally a part of ourselves that is attached to this other person or experience. A career is dying, and there is of course a wish in these moments that people would just have kind of that there wouldn't be any consequence, that we'd be able to go through it however way we go through it. But that's just not the case. There is no right or wrong way, but there are consequences, and it can be really unfair and unjust, but that's just the way it is. Okay, so grief, there's no time limit. There's no time limit in mourning. But as anyone that may have experienced grief, let's talk about the ending of a relationship that at one point we thought at the beginning of the heartbreak we were never going to be able to love again, right? This may be quite common of an experience. We are in love, and then that love is taken away from us. There's a breakup. We didn't anticipate it. And now we no longer have this person in our lives. We can really fall into this place of I'm never going to love again. And then we mourn and we grieve and we process and we talk through, and eventually we may find ourselves opening back up. We may find ourselves being curious about love again. We may find ourselves experiencing moments of joy and pleasure again. And we may find that the person that the relationship ended with is in our hearts in a tender way. We may have now more understanding of the relationship. In some ways, the love doesn't die. It stays in us, but in a way that feels meaningful and allows us to move into the next relationship with a little bit more growth, with a little bit more thoughtfulness. This is a beautiful version of mourning. This is what we're talking about. In a sense, like we're working through something really difficult, and we're able to get to another side where that relationship that broke our heart is still tender in us, and we may reflect on it with a reverence or with a tenderness, but we're still able to fall in love with future humans. Melancholia or depression is something that Freud was really curious about, which is why is it that sometimes we experience a heartbreak, for example, and then we harden against the world, and now we become a recluse and we decide we're never going to love again, and then we never find ourselves able to love again. Something really not only dies but feels irreparable. We no longer find any type of joy in relationships. Two different people may be having two different experiences around a similar situation, and that's what he was very curious on, and that's what I want to talk about today. How do we go from a melancholic type of grief to a mourning type of grief? How do we find our way into a grief that allows us to bring the experience with us in the future rather than keeping us lodged, stuck, paralyzed in the past? This is not by any means a conversation about bypassing pain. I'm never an advocate for bypassing pain. And this is why grief work can be so hard for clinicians to do, because it may be really hard to watch people kind of be in pain, and knowing that particularly really acute stages of grief, that's not the time to do something. And it can be really hard as clinicians, facilitators, space holders to be in that tenderness with somebody, because it can feel really, really destabilizing. This is also true, honestly, not even just in a professional capacity, but in our personal lives, right? We may be friends with somebody whose dad just died, and it can be really hard to know how to then be there for our friend. How do we support our friend go through one of the most trying times that person may experience? And so maybe this episode will help in that too. Okay, so I'm looking at my notes. Let's go into why does grief get stuck, or some theories for why the grief may be getting stuck and turning into a hardness rather than allowing us to kind of metabolize and move through and make sense of and find our way in the future. And again, some of these thoughts are really pulling out of Freud's work, as well as some of my own experiences, what I have seen both as a clinician and in my personal life. Okay, so let's go into kind of one thing. I don't want to number them because there's this. I didn't make this list with a list a priority. Like number one is the most important. So first on my list, why does grief get stuck? It's because potentially of unrecognized feelings. Grief may find itself stuck when we are denying that there's anything to grieve in the first place. And for minor sources of grief, this can be actually a really popular or common way that we may find ourselves stuck in something, and in fact not even aware that we're kind of stuck in something. The unrecognizable feelings may actually even be unconscious. This happens a lot when we're navigating things like a career change. So let's say that you got laid off your job. We may find ourselves surrounding ourselves with people who say things like, maybe this is for the better. You'll find something better. This is not a big deal. You're so investable. People, you're gonna find a new job quickly, and then and so you're really upset about it because you really loved that job, and then you get a new job, and then people will validate. See, you didn't need to be that upset. See, you just had to hold off on your feelings. Which we use this argument so often, like just hold off on your feelings until you know more. And the question I kind of find myself asking is, how long? Like, how long do you hold off on the feelings until things work out? You know, if it took you a year to find a new job, do you have to hold off on the feelings for a year? You know, like 3 months, a day? Like, how long can you hold off? I am personally in the school of thought that we shouldn't hold off on our feelings. Like, we're allowed to have feelings no matter what may change. We're allowed to ride the roller coaster of our internal world. You think your child is going to have their legs amputated. You're anxious. You're at the hospital. You don't know what to do. You're freaking out. And then the doctor comes out and says, actually, your child is going to be fine. Does that mean that there's no reason to freak out and you shouldn't have freaked out until you found out more? I don't think so. I think we're allowed to freak out, and then we're going to know more, and then we can go from there. You know, you can lose your job. You can be devastated by this job. You can get another job tomorrow, and you know, your mood can shift. You can now change. We're allowed to change given the data that our lives offer us, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't feel anything until we have all of the data, because we may never have all of the data. And I think that this calls for like this stoic way of living where just hold off on feelings. But again, to what point? The doctor comes out, your child will be fine, you feel relief. Oh, see, I shouldn't have felt it anyway. The doctor comes back out, oh my gosh, your child, we lost your child. We don't know where he is in the hospital. Now are you allowed to freak out? Oh, we found your child. Now you don't freak out. Like, it just, life is going to continue to offer us ways to bring feelings up in us. And I believe that we're allowed to then have those feelings. Okay, so, but back to the point here. Let's say we're talking about something, right, like getting a new job, and you got fired, you're sad about it, but everyone tells you shouldn't be sad about it. You try to stay, quote unquote, positive. You try to get a positive mindset that you're going to find another job. You end up finding another job. You start this new job, you're very excited about it, but there's something that feels achy. There's something that feels wrong. You're feeling just a little bit lethargic. You're just not quite, like, you're excited about this job, but something feels off. One possibility, one option is that maybe you didn't grieve and mourn your old job. We spend so much time at our jobs. We're spending 40 hours at our jobs. We're developing relationships with our colleagues. We have a rhythm, we have a flow, we have an expectation of a certain income. Like, there's relationships that we're having at our jobs. And so, of course, if you lose it, even if you quit, if you found a new job, if you got fired, it doesn't matter the reason that the job has ended. You're allowed to have feelings about the fact that it ended, even if it worked out, even if you got a better job with more money. The same thing for moving. If we move across the country for a really exciting opportunity, we may have feelings about the fact that we're moving. But oftentimes our culture, and this is again that kind of popular narrative, the common narrative is, but look forward. You have so much to look forward to, but you chose to make this move. So why are you sad about what you're leaving behind? It's going to get better. It's always going to get better. Life is going to get better. You're moving for a better opportunity. You're making more money. Look forward. Be happy. Go better. Be better. I just hit my table here. My invitation is that with every change comes a change. With every change comes a change, and every change comes with an ending, comes with a loss. Something is different. And whatever that change brings, even if it's wonderful, even if we ask for it, we're allowed to have feelings about the loss. We're allowed to have feelings about things. And so often grief gets stuck when we're having unrecognized feelings, when we're trying to force down the quote unquote negative feelings and focusing on the positive future feelings. What that ultimately does is it keeps things inside of ourselves stuck and heavy. And it may get driven unconscious, right? You may kind of push it out of your mind, but something will feel off, something will feel low, something, will feel a little bit not as shiny and bright in the world. When we give ourselves permission to grieve these changes, as small as they may be, we're actually opening up our capacity to then feel excitement about the new thing. It's all intertwined. We can't cut off one feeling and expect ourselves to feel the other. Whenever we're cutting off feelings, we're cutting ourselves from feelings. We're not cutting off a feeling. Yes? Let me repeat that because I think that's important. When we try to cut ourselves off of a feeling, we're not cutting ourselves off of a feeling. We're cutting ourselves off from feelings. And so that includes all of the feelings, including the good ones, including the ones that we're struggling to feel because we want them so bad. So we can either cut ourselves off from all feelings, or we can go into our feelings and recognize the grief and recognize the change, and have that be integrated so that we can also then get even more excited and feel more whole as we go into this new change. There's some unexpected ways. There's really a lot of unexpected ways in which we grieve. There's a lot of things that our culture really tells us that we should be emphasizing the future rather than past. Having a child is an example of this. What do we make of this postpartum depression? I think in many ways, postpartum depression is a way in which we're forced now to grapple with the fact that something has really radically changed. We call this, when you get a puppy, they call it puppy blues, right? Where you thought it was going to be something and now it's not. It's a different thing. And now we're finding ourselves really excited about this thing. We got a puppy, we have a baby. These are amazing, great things that we chose, that we're so privileged to have. But we can also experience a significant loss of the life before baby, the life before puppy, all the things that have to change in order to make space for baby/puppy. Do not listen to culture telling you that your feelings should be simple, that it should be flat. You are excited. You are having baby. You can be excited. You can also be anxious. You can also be nervous. You can also be hesitant. You can also be afraid. You may also be regretful. I know that these are all normal feelings. And it's so hard on a mother to tell her that she's supposed to be one feeling about her child. We are allowed to have all of the feelings about our children, about our partner, about our any relationship that we have. We may both want them and hate them. And this leads us to point number 2, or the second way in which grief gets stuck. And it's around this idea of ambivalent feelings, which ambivalence is a psychoanalytic word that gets used around a lot. Honestly, I use it to mean conflicting feelings, which means that we have feelings of positive, quote unquote negative. Freud used the word ambivalent in Mourning and Melancholia to really think about it in terms of love and hate. And he believed that every relationship, there was both love and hate. And I really like that spaciousness that Freud gives there, where he acknowledges something that, again, I think we often try to flatten, which is even the people that we love most dearly in the world, we may experience moments of hate and rage and all of the feelings towards that individual. But when we have ambivalent feelings, when we have both love and both hate, it does make grief a little bit more complicated. And it makes things complicated in a way that may be paradoxical or maybe kind of the opposite of what we expect, because we tend to think that it's easier to mourn what we hate than what we love. That it's actually really hard to mourn the things that we really love, or that we experience more love than hate in. But Freud actually says the opposite. He believes that it is harder to mourn what we hate than it is to mourn what we love. And his argument goes that it's easier to mourn what we love because it lives within us and we can take it with us in the future. It can become like this warm internal object, internal person. The person that died or the thing that we lost is now internal and goes with us. And we can think about it fondly, and we can make new memories with this person inside of us. There's all sorts of beautiful ways that we do this. Let's say at a wedding that our parent is not able to attend. Let's say our parent died. Having a photo of the parent there. This is the way that we're bringing that parent. We're letting the memory of the parent live on inside of us and in our lives. And so because, again, we're not saying that mourning means that we're now happy. We're talking about mourning as in something is worked through, moving through. There feels like there's movement. That type of mourning may go on for the rest of our lives, but doesn't impinge on our lives. Okay, so his argument is that hate, on the other hand, is actually what it makes grief turn from mourning to melancholia in many ways, because when we hate something, we really can't let it go. We have a really hard time letting go what we hate. It stays something alive within us that we have a hard time letting go of. Because imagine you really hating somebody, let's say a childhood bully that made your life really, really hard. It may be extremely difficult to let go of that hate. And in order for us to mourn, we have to let go of these feelings that are keeping us trapped in a hardness in the past. So when we have ambivalent feelings about something, whether it's a person, whether it's, again, a career, a dream, we may find that it gets harder for us to move from melancholia or depression into a type of mourning that allows things to move through into process. And that can be then really difficult because when we're having ambivalent feelings, let's say that we really loved our partner. This is a great example. Let's say that our partner died of cancer. We really loved our partner. We had a really beautiful life together. Our partner dies, and then we find out that our partner is actually cheating on us. Now we have a different relationship with our partner, don't we? What once was in some ways a more simple type of grief, again, simple, not easy, but less complicated, because the love was so pure and was so easy and was such a beautiful relationship. Now it's mired in confusion and betrayal, and these feelings have nowhere to go because the person is not around to talk to be held accountable, to understand what was going on. It may now feel so much harder to mourn and to grieve our spouse. This is where Freud invited us to consider that that's where melancholia comes in. That's when depression comes in, when we have a difficult time mourning because of our ambivalent feelings towards the object, towards the person. Okay, and so one of the other things that he talks about in terms of depression, melancholia, and I'm not going to get too deep into it because this isn't a podcast episode on depression, is that what we end up finding ourselves doing when we're trying to grieve something that we are having ambivalent feelings about, and oftentimes, by the way, the more difficult feelings go unconscious, and that's what keeps the mourning alive, the grief active, in a way that doesn't feel like it's actually getting moved through. Because the negative, quote unquote, the negative feelings, the difficult feelings, the hatred, the anger are all now driven unconsciously. And so what happens is we start to attack ourselves. I'm bad, I'm wrong, I'm incompetent, how did I let this happen, how could I have gotten fired, right? We attack ourselves, but what we're really trying to do in that is we're attacking the object that we identify with and is now internalized within us. So by object, I mean the other person, the experience, etc., that we identify with, and now we've brought inward, and now we're attacking ourselves. And oftentimes that's how some theories of depression is that depression is a way in which we're hating hating on ourselves something that actually needed to be hated outside of ourselves. So this is a common example of being brought up by an abusive parent. We continue to see the parent as a good parent, but we abuse ourselves. We hate ourselves. What we're really doing there is we're identifying with the parent who abuses us by abusing ourselves. But what really the work is going to be in bringing that anger and that hatred away from ourselves to the object where it belongs, to the parent, because then when it's facing the appropriate party, we can work through it, and then we can find self-love and we can find more spaciousness within ourselves. So when we find ourselves having complicated feelings get driven unconsciously, and now we're attacking ourselves, this really exacerbates this sense of self-loathing, self-hatred, and it can be very hard for us to mourn what we hate. Yes. Okay. So why else does grief get stuck? Another way in which grief gets stuck is through shame. Shame often comes up, yes, because we have ambivalent feelings and some feelings go unconscious, but also because we feel like maybe we're not the right party to be grieving. We may feel like we're not allowed to grieve. Pet grief is a really important type of grief that we often experience a lot of shame around because it was just quote unquote a pet. It shouldn't feel this way, it shouldn't be this way, it shouldn't affect us as long as it does. And so we may experience some shame around it. We do live in a very death-phobic culture that really drives any type of death rituals out of the landscape of our culture. And so we may find ourselves having a really hard time knowing how to grieve and how to be with a death of something, and then a lot of shame around it. It shouldn't be this big. It shouldn't feel this way. This is a big one when the grief gets complicated. Shame can really act as a way in which we prevent ourselves from feeling really difficult feelings. I used to joke in Worthy Women Rise that like shame acts like a condom in that it really prevents us from getting into some really core feeling that wants attention, that wants to get out. If, let's say, our sister is divorcing her spouse, and we really liked that spouse, and that spouse played an integral role in your life in some way, it can be really complicated for you to allow yourself to grieve something that wasn't really your it wasn't your partner, right? It wasn't your spouse, but you have a relationship with that person. If you have a child, an adult child who broke up with their partner and you really liked that partner, you may now have a grief process, but it's different than your child's grief process. And then because we often don't, we're so sensitive that we don't want to take up space, it's not ours to take up, and we want to be there for our child, we may feel like it's wrong for us to have feelings about it. Okay, why else does grief get stuck? Grief gets stuck because we don't talk about it, usually because of shame, but also because we may not come from an environment where talking about difficult feelings was the norm. So we may now try to hold it all ourselves or try to do it all by ourselves, and then wonder why we're continuing to not feel like something is getting moved through, because talking about it is what enlivens it. When we talk about our feelings, when we bring our thoughts outside of us and share it and talk about it, it gets moved. And so whatever isn't getting talked about gets repressed, it gets pushed down, it gets denied, or it stays ruminating and it stays kind of cycling through. It may turn into melancholia or depression. It may turn into other kind of more pathological, problematic symptoms. It's important for us to keep in mind that when we deny something in ourselves, it doesn't just go away. It doesn't disappear. It has a way of coming out. It has a way of acting out. And so when it comes to complicated ways of grief, complicated things that we're not sure how to navigate, talking about it can really, really help. Our thoughts are connected to our feelings. So when we bring words to our thoughts, we bring aliveness to our feelings. And our feelings are what is being invited to explore and have space to be with in order for us to mourn, in order for us to grieve. It can be really hard though. We may not want to talk about it. And again, because we live in such a death illiterate culture, we may find it difficult finding places for us to talk about our grief. And yet those spaces exist. It's out there. And my invitation always is to find those spaces no matter how much work it takes. And I know that that's a big statement. Sometimes when we're really in acute spaces of grief, the energy to talk and to connect may feel absolutely inaccessible. And then what ends up happening is that we prevent ourselves from the very support and connection that will make the biggest difference for us. And then, of course, the final reason why, not final, I'm sure there's many, many more, but the last one that I'll mention here today of why does grief get stuck is because we're so afraid that if we touch the grief or if we touch the feelings that are coming up, it's going to consume us. We're terrified of our feelings consuming us. We're terrified that if we open the wounds of our grief, it is just going to destabilize and deteriorate us. It is just going to overwhelm us. And usually when we have this fear that certain feelings are going to consume us, it usually comes out of an experience where it did. It comes out of an experience of having had something really big, a feeling or experiences or a certain set of feelings where we were continuously told had no space to be processed and explored with our caregivers. Something got overwhelmed, and now we're so afraid that it will happen again. And this is where it can be really useful to bring somebody in to support you, a professional, a grief counselor, or a therapist, somebody who doesn't necessarily have to specialize in grief, but can, right? But somebody that knows how to hold this with you, because feelings won't. It's often not the feelings that hurt us. It's the not feeling our feelings that hurt us, right? It's what gets repressed that gets acted out. And so it's important for us to find spaces where we can expand our capacity to feel certain things. And if you identify as someone who feels too much all the time, it may be useful to find someone that can help hold some of these feelings, contain these feelings with you, so that they're not so terribly overwhelming. But this fear that if we let ourselves feel the feelings, we're going to cry, we're going to get overwhelmed, we're going to get unstable in some way, can really prevent us from working through some of this stuff. And that's when it becomes depression. See, we're terrified that if we talk about our feelings, that we're going to get depressed. But usually what happens is that it's by not talking about it, by avoiding it, denying it, and then having those feelings go unconscious that then drives us into depression. Feeling more and feeling well, like feeling our feelings in a well way, in a whole way, will not lead to depression. That's a big, bold statement, I know, but that's just based on my clinical experience and knowledge. Okay, so is it helpful to talk about, like, what do we do? Like, how do we kind of make sure that our grief doesn't get stuck? Well, one, like, we don't have to become afraid of this, I don't want this episode to be a fear-mongering, like, bad things are going to happen if you don't, like, I'm not intending that. I am just suggesting that if you're finding yourself stuck in grief, that you're not alone and that there's ways to work through it and you don't have to do it alone. But talking generally is better. And this is where talk therapy can be so useful, but there's other modalities and other forms of healing that can also be useful. But what I particularly love about talk therapy is that we're not just talking. It's not just an intellectual exercise. When we're talking and we're with somebody who's paying attention and who's thinking with you and in the feelings and helping you think about things and feel things, oh my gosh, we start to understand ourselves more. We start to get more insight into ourselves, but also we start to have a different experience with another human. And that can be really, really life-changing. It's also important to know when we're doing grief work is that grief often comes in waves. It's often not like a stagnant or stuck way of being and feeling. And so if you're feeling stagnant, stuck, kind of this constant sense of grief, you may be, not always, but it may be something is getting unprocessed, because when we are in the process of being with our grief, what we typically find is that we're not in touch with our grief every second of every day, except for the acute stages, of course. But what we find is that we go in and out of our grief. Something reminds us of our grief and we go back into it. We forget, something takes our attention, we get focused on something else, and then we get back in touch with our grief. And sometimes the waves can feel really disorienting because they may get further apart as the more time and process takes place. We may find ourselves then getting surprised when we're having an emotional moment. But again, there's no time is not a friend here, in that I know a common adage is time heal all wounds. I just don't find that to be true, and I actually find that we know that to be true. It is more in common culture to know that time does not heal all wounds, because we see it on television and in movies and in books. What happens when people don't process their grief? They stay stuck. And it hardens them. The time, in some ways, is a construct. There are experiences that we have that, as we're talking about, we get pulled right back into that moment 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I want to be really driving it home here that time isn't your friend. Time isn't going to do the work that you have to do, and that you have to do this work if you want to grow. Okay, I mean, if you don't want to grow, you don't have to grow. I mean, you don't have to grow, but if you want to grow, you're going to have to do this work. So acknowledging that it comes in waves can be really useful. And again, remember, there's no right or wrong way. There's no right or wrong way to grieve. There are consequences to how we grieve, of course, and there's all sorts of ways in which we have to grapple with that, but there's ultimately no right or wrong way. Okay. And then here's a little thing that I wrote from a woman named Claudia Louise. She's on Instagram. I absolutely love her presence and I love her words. I love what she writes. And she said, have faith that discovering new emotional experiences will help you feel more regulated and whole. And that, I think, is such a beautiful reminder for us as we're grappling through any type of difficult emotional experience, is that discovering new emotional experience, letting ourselves feel more things, allowing ourselves to try to feel different things will help. It helps us to feel more whole. The more we allow ourselves to think and feel certain parts of ourselves, the more regulated and whole we become. And we can't learn and grow from things that we refuse to talk about. So in order to grow, we have to grieve, and we have to talk about our grief. We have to find spaces where our grief has the opportunity to exist, and there's a holding of it with other people. We cannot learn and grow from things we refuse to talk about. And so if you're finding yourselves not wanting to talk about certain things, that right there is an indication, is a sign that there's something that's not wanting to be examined and worked through. And we do it for many reasons, right, that I just shared. We're scared, etc. However, we're also keeping ourselves stuck. And we don't have to. We can. Sometimes that's just where we are, but we don't have to. And there's ways that we can move through and work through and talk through and find a vitality in our mourning. So I think that's all I have for us today. I hope that this is of some use. I'm also in the show notes going to link a few previous podcast episodes that I've done about grief. Grief is a continual exploration and conversation, and I'm here to kind of normalize it and to encourage all of us to get in touch with grief. And if you're like, well, I don't know if I have anything to grieve, well, just look at where you don't want to bring your attention to. Just notice what you don't want to talk about. And I'm not saying talk about like with the specific person, I'm saying talk about in general. Like if you had the right person, would you talk about this? And if the answer is yes, then it's time to find the right person. Because when we talk through things, we feel through things, we work through things, we grow, we become more expansive, and we find ways to mourn in a way that enriches us and allows our lives to be deeply impacted and moved by love. because to grieve is to love. And isn't that what we're here to experience? Aren't we here to experience love and more love? We increase our capacity to love by allowing ourselves to grieve. Yes? All right. Thank you for being here with me today. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Reclaim.